When I do deer hunting seminars on do-it-yourself public land whitetail hunting, there's one question that always seems to come up, and that's this. How deep do I have to go? How far away from the parking areas on a public land do I have to go to get away from the hunting pressure? And that's a really, really good question. And it's, of course, the obvious answer is, well, it varies a lot, and I'll go into that in a second. And it's not always about distance. It's more about barriers sometimes. And I'm going to give you a few points that will really help you understand this concept well. But first, I wanted to read something from a magazine article I wrote. This is from September 2016 issue of North American Whitetail magazine. I've written a column on do-it-yourself public land hunting in North American whitetail for quite a few years. And I just want to read you the lead from this column that I wrote back in 2016 because I think you'll find it pretty interesting. I'd been hunting a public area in western Iowa for several days when I became convinced that it was time to try another spot. So with my tree stand and my pack in my hand, and my tree stand and pack on my back and climbing sticks and bow in my hands, I headed to the truck. Suddenly, I came down with a case of the quick step. With a rumbling in my abdomen that spurred me on, I decided I could make it over the last small hill to my truck and then take care of the business. By the time I got to my truck, I was really in a hurry. There were other trucks in the parking lot. I just left my stuff in a heap, struggled out of my pack, and hustled 20 yards into the woods. I was just about to do the business when I looked up and found myself in a stare down with a buck. I remember this very, very vividly. His rack was outside his ears, and it was massive and tall. He was 25 yards away and locked onto me. The deer looked me over for an embarrassingly long time as I stood there with my bibs around my ankles and a roll of toilet paper in my hand instead of my bow. Then he just tucked his tail, lowered his head, and disappeared. I'd been hunting over a mile from the truck, but a buck anyone would die for was only 40 yards from my front bumper, bedded in a cattail swamp the size of my living room. That was a really important but embarrassing lesson for me. And it helped me learn that you don't always have to go a long ways from the parking or access areas to get to big bucks. Mature bucks that have lived on public land for any length of time get really, really good at patterning humans and avoiding them. They just get to be masters of even being within a few feet or yards of a hunter, and the hunter never knows they're there. So it's often important to get a long ways from the truck, but sometimes there's other ways to get to areas that you can find a big buck that isn't necessarily as much work. So let's talk first of all about these areas that bucks will tuck themselves into to just avoid humans, and they might be pretty close to where there's a lot of activity. And when I say other hunters, I'm also talking about coon hunters and squirrel hunters and berry pickers or whatever. So it's not only just about the other deer hunters that are operating on the public property. So barriers, an example, it could be something that is really close to where a hunter just wouldn't expect to look for a deer. Like that buck that I just mentioned was literally 40 yards from the front bumper of my truck, and he was in a little cattail swamp, and people were driving by. He was, maybe 100 yards or less from a road, and people moving in and out of there. There was other hunters coming and going, and he just knew that nobody would look right there. So there's other pockets like that on the public hunting areas as well. If you just kind of really look the place over and analyze the way people are traveling through, you'll be surprised to find that there are little pockets of places where these bucks will hang out, and they get really good at avoiding people, and you just have to figure out where they are. So another really good way to get away from the crowds and find these deer that don't get disturbed as much is a barrier. And of course, distance is a barrier. Most people will look at a spot that's, say, a mile. You talk about a half a mile, that's a long ways through the woods. And that's kind of about as far as people will go. And your hard-working hunters will go farther than that, but you you also want to keep in mind that the majority of hunting pressure on public properties is from locals, and primarily they're hunting on evenings and weekends. So they just have to be close to accesses. You can't, if you get off work at 4 and it gets dark at 6, you're not going to go a mile back into the woods to get in a tree stand. So keep that in mind also. Now, when I talk about barriers, distance obviously is a barrier. So getting back, a mile, mile and a half, or even 2 miles, I've been in areas 2 miles back, and when you get back there, you're not thinking so much about, it's a lot of work to haul my stands in here and stuff like that. You're thinking more about, if I shoot a buck back in here, how am I going to get it out? That's a barrier for people, okay? So distance is a big barrier, but it's not the only barrier. I have crossed rugged terrain that kept most people out, and maybe a small cliff or a steep hill or something like that, maybe going through an area where there's a bunch of trees and branches that are all down, and you just have to struggle your way through it. That's a barrier. One of the best barriers is water. There's been quite a few times when I have found deer that are pretty much undisturbed just by putting on a pair of waders and going across a creek or a small swamp, a cattail slough or whatever. A lot of places, bigger bucks figure out that they can hang out on islands in the cattail sloughs, and they hardly ever get disturbed. And most people won't go to the trouble to go through the cattails and struggle through them, and then you're in water and out of water, and it's just hard work. And most people just won't go to the trouble. So, keep in mind that if you want to get away from the hunting pressure, you have to go where most people simply aren't willing to go or aren't thinking about, as in the case of these deer that are somewhat close. And the last thing to think about is another important factor. Keep in mind that most mature bucks do not spend their entire lives on public land. That's probably true in some cases in huge blocks of state forests or whatever, but in most cases deer are going back and forth on and off of public hunting properties, wildlife management areas, and so forth. A lot of public wildlife management areas and state hunting areas are composed of undisturbed cover, undisturbed by the plow, I guess you would say. They're pretty thick cover, and they're good bedding areas on them, but they're surrounded by agriculture. So a lot of times deer bed on the public land, and then they go off into the fields at night. So that's another thing that's really important to keep in mind, is sometimes you don't have to penetrate the middle of a great big piece of property. Sometimes the edges of that property can be really good too, and so maybe you're going 3/4 of a mile or more into a piece of property, but you're not penetrating the center of it. You're actually just working the edges of it. So always keep those things in mind. There's a lot of variables and a lot of things to think about. If you're gonna hunt where there isn't much hunting pressure, you've got to figure out what the bucks have figured out, or you've just got to go away from the areas where most people simply won't go. So hopefully this is helpful to you, and if you're going through your mind thinking about some of the public hunting properties that you hunt right now, which you probably are, that's what I'm doing, and trying to figure out how to hunt them more effectively, maybe this will give you some ideas of some areas to go check out. So thanks for being a subscriber. If you're not already, please hit the subscribe button, and we got more videos like this coming, so stay tuned, and thanks for being a part of it.